farmer, he wouldn't have enough to also take to the market to sell. What happens is the remaining available he has, he will find a way of increasing his sale in order to make profit. I give you a scenario. Even the farming season, I found maize and my harvest was 100 bags. Now after the sale, I realized 500,000. Now the next farming season, I had 50 bags. Now how do I sell 50 bags and raise 500,000? That brings us to the issue of what? Decline in food security. Now he has to increase the price. Now you have maize being sold at 300. Before you know it, it has increased to what? 1.5. Why? There is a decline in what? Yield, and therefore farmers will have to what? Increase prices so they can meet their needs. Now the objectives of my studies are just two: to identify the impacts of climate change on livelihoods in Nigeria. Like you heard in my profile, I'm interested in livelihoods, and not just livelihoods, but rural livelihoods. We've been talking about climate change, climate change, climate change. I believe 90 to 100% of us seated here are literate. So when I say climate change, I believe you can relate with me. But when I go down to your village and I come across a person and I tell him climate change, will he really understand what I'm trying to say? Now I'm more interested in what? Rural livelihoods. Now 80% of Nigeria's population are rural farmers. Agriculture is being done by 80% rural population. So I feel this campaign needs to be stepped down to the rural areas. Then the second is just but to recommend action plans towards ensuring a sustainable livelihood in the midst of the threat of climate change. Now, my study was able to establish that climate change indeed has great impacts on livelihoods in Nigeria. Livelihood assets identified by the British Department of Finance and International Development, they identified 5 assets. And what do we mean by asset? Things that are of what? Value. So when we're talking of sustainability as a concept, this framework as adopted, or rather constructed by PFID, they term it Sustainable Livelihood Framework. It means that it's a framework that will ensure that even as generations come and go, these issues of climate change will be adequately addressed. Now they talked about the natural assets, and by natural assets we're talking about land, water bodies, forest. We talk about the physical assets, we're talking about schools, roads, bridges, and buildings. We talk about the financial asset, which has to do with what? Gross domestic product, otherwise known as what? GDP. Now it is agreed, or you agree with me, that studies have shown that the agricultural sector in Nigeria contributes the highest GDP. Then we'll talk about household income. If most of the population are farmers, then it means that the livelihood of most of the Nigerian population is centered on what? Agriculture. Then we'll talk about the social asset. Learning activities, working environments, community development, associations. What we are doing here is also a social asset. Forum that brings people together to discuss topical issues. Now, based on the 3 concepts I've been able to raise, these are highlights of my findings. Firstly, agriculture remains the mainstay of economies of most developing countries, Nigeria inclusive. As I mentioned earlier, 80% of the rural population in Nigeria have their livelihood. When we say livelihood, we are talking about means of survival. What do I do to earn a living? And studies have shown that 80% engage in what? Agriculture. And when we say agriculture, it's a compound word. Crop cultivation and livestock production are not only agricultural practices. However, 80% of rural population practice only what? Crop cultivation and livestock production. We have others like horticulture and the rest. Then climate change has impacted a great deal on crop yield. If you remember, my first motivation is why the rising prices, why are crop yields declining? Now, increased temperature and irregular rainfall patterns have affected availability of soil water, thereby affecting crop production. Now, my fellow senior colleagues will agree with me, the soil has consequences. We have the soil air, the soil water, the organic matter, and the mineral matter. So beneath the soil, the source of replenishment is from rainfall. So when we have a decline in rainfall, definitely there will be a decline in what? Availability of what? Soil water. It means that plants will not be able to access water from the soil due to what? A shortfall in water. Now, climate change has led to outbreak of pests and diseases that damage crops, thereby reducing yield and quality, creating issues of what? Food security. Now, when there is a decline in rainfall and there is increase in temperature, it makes the condition favorable for some organisms to thrive, thereby inflicting damage on the crops. Now, flooding events over the country have led to destruction of farmlands, restricted free movement of people and goods, presented various health challenges, affected income of households, damaged properties, and led to the loss of life. Now, this statistics I quoted was from the Nigerian Red Cross in 2022. It was believed that the casualties in terms of life lost was the highest in over a decade. Now, on the 9th of September, to be precise, Borno came under the news. And what was the issue? Flooding. Now, I was listening to Arise this morning, and they were trying to argue whether the flooding was as a result of climate change or it was as a result of negligence. I heard one of the panelists say an assessment was done on the nature of the dam, and it was established that the walls were already weak. Now, I asked the question, a dam is not a natural body of water, it's artificial. It has a what? A capacity. And what happens if that capacity is exceeded? Definitely there will be a breach in the walls. So whether they agree with it or not, climate change contributed to that because it's as a result of what? A heavy downpour. If the rains were not intensive, then it means the quantity of water that the dam could otherwise hold wouldn't have changed. So there wouldn't have been any flooding in the first instance. But because of the pressure being exerted on the walls of the dam due to what? Excessive rainfall, that led to the what? The collapse of the walls of the dam and resulted in flooding. Now, Nigeria is predicted to incur heavy loss to the tune of over $400 billion by 2050 if issues regarding climate change are not properly addressed. I mean, this is according to World Bank Group report of 2021. Now, if we are looking at $400 billion, I don't know how many nairas that will translate into, but you agree with me that it's a huge figure. Now, as rightly said, Nigeria as a nation or Africa as a continent contributes only 3.7% to climate change. Like Prof rightly mentioned, do we have heavy industries? No. But because there is no definite layer in the atmosphere, activities that are being done, we have heavy industrialized nations like China, America. They are the major pollutants of the ozone layer. But because we have a universal atmosphere, the effect is felt by all. So in terms of our emission rate as a country, it is still very, very minimal. However, this report from World Bank puts it that Nigeria stands the risk of being affected. Why? We have deficiency in terms of what? Technology to cope with the what? Challenges being posed by what? Climate change. Next is drought conditions as well as increased temperatures affect the survival of livestock, especially cattle. Cattle reproduction rates is affected by increased temperature and drought conditions. I'll make an illustration with human beings. Whenever the temperature is high or the sun is high, what happens to you? You feel dehydrated. It's the same thing with livestock. The increase in temperature makes it difficult for them to what? Thrive or survive, and that will affect their production rates. The livestock industry is believed to account for about 36.5% of consumed protein. I know of people that will not eat food if there's no form of protein. If you serve them any meal, regardless of what it is, if it doesn't contain any protein, they are less interested in the food. Now the implication is that if livestock is being affected, then 36.5% of consumed protein in Nigeria will be what? Affected. Now, households account for 10% gross domestic product. We're talking about just the livestock sector. We're not even talking about the crop cultivation sector. Remember, I based it on crop cultivation and livestock production. An important one, fuel wood, or what we refer to as firewood. Artisanal mining, local mining, that's what it means. Herbal medicine production, lumbering activities, and livelihood activities that also accelerate the level of climate change. Now, in as much as we are talking about the impact climate change has had on livelihoods, it is also interesting to know that there are certain activities or livelihood activities that also accelerate the rate of what? Climate change. Examples of these I have mentioned. Now, when we talk about climate change, most especially we are referring to the rate of what? Carbon buildup in the atmosphere. One of such is the use of what? Firewood. Studies has it that Africa and Asia still rely heavily on firewood as a cheap source of energy for what? Heating and cooking. I know that almost every household utilize either firewood or what? Charcoal as a source of what? Heating. So that in itself can also accelerate the rate of climate change. Then the next thing we talk about the cutting down of trees for timber and firewood, as well as harvesting of herbs for local medicine and uncontrolled mining activities, reduces the amount of vegetation cover and increases the rate of evaporation. And trees are believed to be what we call carbon sinkers. They help us in absorbing the excess carbon in the atmosphere. So if we have lesser trees, it implies that the rate of carbon buildup in the atmosphere will be what? High. Then we'll talk about timber. It is interesting to point us back to the projected tool we had. Nigeria has the highest percentage of unprotected forest. I can just simply carry my chainsaw, drive into any forest, cut down as many trees as I want, put them in my lorry and go away. Nobody will ask me, why am I doing that? Now, these are some of the implications of what? Climate change. Am I skipping one? Conclusion. Agriculture still remains the mainstay of Nigeria's economy, as most livelihoods depend on it. Climate change has continued to threaten the well-being and survival of Nigerians, and that of other nations being a global threat, like we'll be able to establish. It's a global phenomenon. So even if the activities are being carried out in another part of the world, the impact is felt globally. Livelihoods cannot thrive in the face of this daunting challenge, climate change, except deliberate and coordinated actions are taken to confront this menace. The future still remains bleak for Nigerians in the wake of this event. I believe this is one of the reasons we are gathered here, to seek what? Coordinated action. So what are some of the recommendations? Massive and aggressive sensitization campaigns, down to the grassroots, like I earlier mentioned, involving the rural areas. This could be done by agencies such as National Registration Agency, media houses, civil society organizations, NGOs, various levels of education, including you and I, because we are knowledgeable in what climate change entails, so we should be able to sensitize the public. Training of more agricultural extension workers across the 774 local governments in Nigeria to step down the knowledge of climate change impact to the grassroots. This will help farmers in the rural areas to prepare adequately for the farming season. Imagine if the report released by NIMED is utilized by farmers. We wouldn't have been recording some of these issues of failure of crop. But what happened is people are used to the regular cycle. They know when the rainfall sets, that is onset, and they know the period of time the rains are expected to cease, that is cessation. So it is without prior knowledge that they just go to the farm and then they cultivate. But what happens if there is a reversal in that pattern? That is when we begin to record loss in crop yield. Now, training of farmers on climate-smart agricultural practices, such as drip irrigation, and planting of drought-resistant varieties, amongst others. Reduction of heavy reliance on firewood as a cheap source of heating and cooking by households, improved cook stoves, honeycomb briquettes, as well as table gas burners can be distributed to low-income households and vulnerable groups as well as an intervention program towards the fight against climate change. We have several intervention programs by the federal government. Let me use that. We have recently the PCNGI, Presidential Compressed Natural Gas Initiative, that is aimed at what? Converting vehicles, is that not so, to run on CNG. which is believed it will lead to what? Lesser emission. Prof mentioned the issue of hybrid cars also. I remember one of our senators, Ben Murray Bruce, common sense. He tried to push a bill that Nigerians should focus or shift into what? Hybrid cars. But I asked the question, according to SDG 7, affordable and clean energy. How many of us can afford hybrid cars? That will translate to no Nigerian having a car at all, because those cars are quite expensive. Today, a Tokumbo car, the normal Corolla 2005, you can't get it for less than 4.5 million. How much is your salary? So the implication of that will amount to all of us will adopt a slogan we refer to as, it is not that far. What does that mean? We dump the cars and we begin to what? To trek, because we cannot afford cars. We want to preserve the climate, we have to pay the price. So it means that Nigerians will no longer use cars, but we'll use our legacies, Benz. Now, creation of forest rangers, that brings me back to the issue of unprotected forests. Now we need to safeguard our forest reserves. And how do we do that? Now, one of my recommendations is creation of a forest task force in the name of forest rangers. Now, their duty will strictly be to man and protect our forests as well as our natural reserves. Sequel to that again is licensing of all timber producers in the country will ensure that their activities are properly regulated. I know that we need timber for various forms of construction. There is virtually no construction work that will take place without the requirement of timber. Now, what this happens, we talked about afforestation and something came to my mind. Where I come from, there is a bread that we call the slogan, chop one, chop two. Okay, so let's adopt the slogan, cut one, plant three. What does that mean? If you're cutting down a tree, you should be able to replace that tree. What that means is we'll make the activities of these timber operators progress in a sustainable manner. Just as all of us that own vehicles are registered in one way or the other and allowed to drive our cars on the road, these people that are into the production of timber should also be checked, so that when something comes up, we know who is going into which forest, who is cutting down which tree. I believe that way we will be able to be successful in the fight against climate change. Once again, thank you for listening.